the flash
Right.
the flash technique and about EMDR reprocessing of stressful memories. And so I was wondering, it talked about, if you had a specific memory that you wanted to work on, you could work on it that way.
And let me just interrupt you to say that is not something that I do.
Okay.
Our program at UCSF has done presentations about EMDR, but that is not my
Okay, thank you.
My realm.
Okay.
Oh my gosh. So thank you all for your introductions. And whoever spoke last and said, oh, they had heard about this in the OLAC newsletter, because I'm like, how did you all find each other? Like, you're all over the country, and how did this happen? Always kind of amazing to me. So thank you. And thank you, Laura. I'm always honored and delighted when people reach out and say, oh, I heard something, and would you give a talk? And of course, hearing your questions, your concerns, it's like, oh, we could spend the rest of the day talking about all this. I taught an 8-week class at Sonoma State this past winter, and it kind of takes that long to go into all of these topics. And yes, I am a poet, and poetry has been part of my life for my entire life. And I have had this amazing opportunity of sort of ending my professional health career in this realm of using what I call poetic medicine, using poetry as a healing modality. So I tend to start any talk that I give with some kind of poem. And this is a poem by a poet named Elizabeth Berg called Talk Before Sleep. I like to think she looked out the window one last time the night she died, and saw with a new understanding the placement of the stars. I like to think something incomprehensibly vast and complex moved into her soul at that moment, and that it, not pathology, was what took her breath away. I like to think something incomprehensibly vast and complex moved into her soul at that moment, and that it, not pathology, was what took her breath away.
Wow.
So when I became a nurse in the late 1980s, as I was older I was in my late 30s, and I'd been a medical school dropout in 1971 and instead hitchhiked to California from dropping out of Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, and hitchhiked across the country, and sort of lived a very different kind of hippie lifestyle for a long time. Got a degree in art at Judy Chicago's Feminist Studio Workshop, doing art and writing in Los Angeles. Realized I wasn't ever going to make a living as an artist or poet, and learned all kinds of healing modalities of, studied herbs, studied various multicultural shamanic techniques with teachers, all kinds of things. And then in 1988, when I was 35 and my best friend Kim was 30, she went off on her motorcycle to the Yosemite Women's Music Festival, and she was not a good motorcycle driver. And I had had a dream 2 nights before she left that she was in a terrible accident. And so the night before she left, I gave her a piece of paper. This was way before cell phones, with all of the phone numbers where I might be able to be reached. And I said, I'm just worried you're going to be out there in the world on your motorcycle. If something happens, I want you to have, all my phone numbers. And she kind of was like, oh, you're being like my mother, na. Well, several days later, after the music festival, the phone rang, and I knew the minute the phone rang what the call was. And she was on her way back from the music festival to Mendocino, where we all lived. And she'd been in an accident on the freeway in Marin County, just north of San Francisco. And she was in intensive care. And it was the police calling because they had found this little piece of paper in her wallet. And I still tell people, no matter what information you have in your cell phones, it's always good to have some card in your wallet that has your, emergency contact people, ideally your power of attorney for healthcare, that has an actual physical thing, because the police do look for that. So she ended up in the intensive care unit for 3 weeks, in what we call a coma. She was hooked up to every machine in medical world. She had not had a helmet on, so her head was like about this big, but she had leather everywhere else, so the rest of her body was actually in pretty good shape. But she lay there in a coma for 3 weeks, and I spent that 3 weeks pretty much camped out in the ICU at Marin General. This was in the days when they actually let people like stay in waiting rooms. And there was this whole group of crazy wild women from Mendocino who like camped out and did ceremony on the front lawn of the hospital. And I would go into the ICU late at night and put crystals on her body and run energy, and all the numbers would come down on the machines. Her intracranial pressure would come down and her blood pressure would come down. The nurses would run and going, what are you doing? It's like, oh, nothing, just kind of running some energy here. And every time I walked into that ICU, I would hear literally the voice of my grandmother, who was born in a shtetl in Russia in 1877 and ran away from home to become a nurse midwife. And I kept hearing her voice saying, this is the work you are here to do on this earth. You are here to witness people dying, to hold space for the people around them. And to be a midwife, just as we have midwives to bring spirits into this world, we need midwives to help spirits leave this world. And, back in the 1980s, nobody was talking about death doulas. That word wasn't a thing. So I thought of myself as a midwife to the dying. My book, Last Acts of Kindness, is stories of my midwifing people in the dying process. As soon as Kim died, which was after 3 weeks in the ICU on all the machines, she finally had horrible pneumonia and died after they tried to resuscitate her, and it was very ugly. As soon as she died, that was when I went to nursing school, knowing that in order to be a midwife to the dying, I was going to have some legitimate credential. I couldn't just come in with my bag of crystals and my tarot cards and whatever else. And so I needed to be legit, and I understood that and became a nurse. And first I worked in oncology for years. And then I worked in critical care and ran the intensive care unit in Mendocino Coast Hospital. And it was in ICU where I really understood how people should not die, and the conversations that never happen enough about death and dying. And I knew that my work was bigger than that, that the truth is spiritual care of the dying is what care of the dying is. And so in the mid 90s, I went and studied with Joan Halifax, a Buddhist teacher in Santa Fe, who started teaching a course called Being with Dying for healthcare professionals. And this was just at the very beginning of her doing this work. She hadn't written her book yet. She was just kind of testing out all of her teachings. And I was kind of in her first crew of doing that. I was very honored to be there and learned a lot, and kind of said to Joan at the end, are you okay if I take this work out? And she said, yeah, make it your own, do what you need to do with it. So myself and another woman up in Mendocino had our own nonprofit that she had used to run the alternative school. And so I started teaching workshops in spiritual care of the dying, outside of my hospital hours. And I just always knew that this, as the voice came to me, when I feel like Kim's dying, in her dying, she gave me the greatest gift of my life, which was to really understand why I'm here and what the work was I'm supposed to do, because it has been the work of my life for the last 40 years. And I'm just so grateful. And I've done it in many different ways, in the intensive care unit, in hospital situations, working privately with people at home who needed someone at their bedside. Like I said, before death doulas were a thing. And then when I moved to San Francisco, because I needed to write a book. And this book was the book I needed to write. And most people move to the country to write their books. I felt like I could go to the city, get a part-time job where I'd make a lot more money than I made in the country, so I'd have time to write a book. Of course, the first thing that happened when I got to San Francisco was that I got a full-time job as the clinical director at Zen Hospice Project, which was falling apart at the time. And I had to do a lot of work to help patch it together. And then I left there, and for 12 years, I ran a community-based palliative care program at Jewish Family and Children's Services, which is a huge nonprofit social service agency, the largest one west of the Mississippi, and trained palliative care volunteers in the community. I trained a couple of hundred people to go and be with people in their homes who were suffering, not necessarily on hospice yet, but who were suffering and had a serious illness, and trained people to just to be present with them was really what that's about. And that's been a lot of my work for the last years, is sort of leading workshops, talking to people about what it means to show up for people who are dying. And in order to show up for people who are dying, we have to face our own mortality. We can't really be present for others if we don't have any sense of what that means. So for the last few years, I've taught a class called Last Acts of Kindness through the program I work with at UCSF, which is kind of a 4-part series that goes into facing our own mortality, what that means. Certainly, in order to be an end-of-life doula, one has to go through that process of what it means that none of us gets out of here alive. That's just the bottom line. I partly do that work by also leading advanced care planning workshops with people. I'm assuming that most people on this screen probably have their own advanced directive for healthcare completed. What I have found over the years, however, is that a lot of times people like say, oh yeah, I did one of those, I did it 10 years ago, it's done. Well, it's never done. I mean, those documents have to be living documents. And when, so when I lead workshops, I lead them in a 2-part series to go over all the questions, and then to send people home with the homework of, what does life support mean to you? What does quality of life mean to you? Because we throw those words out, and yet sometimes we haven't really explored what is quality of life to me? You know, what's my personal line in the sand of, if this happens, no, I don't want to keep pursuing treatment, interventions, whatever that is. So I think these conversations that are hard to have and that are not common, as people noted in their introductions, are critical. You know, part of the work for any of us who understand our mortality is that we have to normalize these conversations. You know, there are cultures where death and dying is part of the reality of the culture. You know, in Buddhist cultures, you are practicing all the time for this ultimate time when you leave this body. You know, the great quote from Plato of, what's the most important thing to do in life? And he said, practice dying. One of the ways to practice dying is to really work with our own mortality. I'm in the midst right now of leading a year-long course called A Year to Live, based on Stephen Levine's book, A Year to Live. And, you know, every month sort of going deeper into what it means that we're alive and what it means that we're going to die. And yes, we create these documents with our wishes, but we refine those wishes and they change as we get older, as we have serious illness, as we watch our friends and lovers die, our ideas change. And it's so important to make sure that we communicate the changes that we feel about how we want to live and die, and that we also put them in writing so that it's part of our ongoing fluid legal documents. But the conversations are just critical to keep having. You know, I have 3 pages of addendums to my own advance directive, and it used to say, the only time I'd be willing to be hooked up to a ventilator is if I was in a sudden car accident, my lung was punctured, and I just needed to be on a ventilator to heal for a few weeks. Well, in 2018, when I had a recurrence of ovarian cancer, I was first diagnosed in 2013. I realized I actually don't want to spend any time, and this is before COVID. I don't want to spend any time in an ICU hooked up to machines. If it's my time to go, it's my time to go. And so I had to change that part of my advance directive, that no, I'm not willing to do that. And I think, you know, doing that ongoing self-exploration of what's important, what is my line in the sand, what is quality of life for me? Does it mean I can walk outside to my garden? Does it mean I'm able to travel? Does it mean I want to stay alive for a certain event to happen? When my sister had inflammatory breast cancer with metastatic disease for 11 years. And she was so determined to live until her daughter graduated from high school. And she ended up living till her daughter graduated from college because she was so determined to stay alive. But she died when she was 57. It's just so important to stay current with what our feelings are, what our fears are. As I said, to keep just normalizing these conversations. Yes, it's hard to initiate conversations about death and dying in a culture that is still so death phobic. And yet all of you have already taken that step to say, yeah, this is part of life. And as we get older, it's a closer part of life. I had lunch with a friend the other day who was 88, and she said, wow, the 80s are really different. Like, I'm feeling myself getting closer to the exit door. And I remember when I was probably a lot of you know who Ronnie Gilbert was.
Yeah.
Um, I was Ronnie's midwife when she was dying. We were friends for a long time. I was very good friends with her partner as well. And Ronnie was actually died at the Redwoods. Um, and she was 86 or 87 when she died. And I remember her saying to me, you know, I didn't even think about being old till I turned 80. Like after 80, I thought, oh, okay, I guess I'm old now. And you know, she had a lot of things wrong with her body. But actually, towards the end, she had kind of a very sudden event where she had a lot of abdominal pain and she ended up in the emergency room at the local hospital. And her partner and I were there with her, and the doctor came in. You know, they did scans and said, you know, you have a blockage. This is likely cancer. You know, we can go in and do this exploratory surgery and figure out what's going on. You know, she was 86. And she just looked at the doctor and she's like, why would I do that? Like her line in the sand was very clear for her of like, no, I'm not going to have some big major surgery, which is going to be so hard to recover from. She had had a hard enough time recovering from hip surgery. She knew that if it was cancer, which it likely was, she wasn't going to do chemotherapy and all the kinds of treatments that were going to be offered to her. She said, just send me home. Let me be comfortable. And I think the doctors are sometimes shocked when a patient is that clear of like, really? You don't want us to cut you open and figure out what to do next? And what it's like, oh, yeah, you're 86. That's probably not such a good idea. Um, and it teaches clinicians a lot when people are clear about their wishes. Like, yeah, this is who I am. This is what I want. I'm going to go home. We're going to be on hospice. I'm going to live as best I can for as long as I can. Which is also what, you know, I mean, the program I work in is a palliative care education. So palliative care and hospice are similar. They're both about relieving suffering on all levels, mental, spiritual, physical, clinical. Hospice is palliative care in the last 6 months of life. But palliative care, when someone has a serious illness, should be at least attempted to be accessed um, as early as possible, because palliative care clinicians um, can really help people navigate the system and deal with suffering in different ways. I know someone talked about the fact that their partner is set up to go to Switzerland for end of life, partly because of dementia. And yes, that is a big challenge in our culture, that people can't, once you are diagnosed with dementia, you can't necessarily make your own choices, which is really hard. I do encourage people, though, if the dementia isn't very advanced, to be in touch with some palliative care team to see if possibly things could be rearranged so that the End of Life Option Act could be pursued in this country. I worked with a woman 2 years ago up here in Sebastopol, where I live, who had ALS, and whose neurologist and doctors were basically saying, oh, you're not sick enough yet. We can't give you the prescription for end of life medication. And she too had gotten all the information to go to Switzerland. And yet, you know, here she was wheelchair bound. She was oxygen dependent. The idea of what this sup was going to be to get her to Switzerland was a whole other level of suffering. And I was able to help them, you know, navigate the healthcare system, get a palliative care clinician on board, talk to the neurologist, help people understand this woman is actually at the end of life. And she was able to get the medications and have a really quite beautiful death that she orchestrated here in her home. And she was only 65, and she had been an outdoors woman and active and just had quite a life. And she's when I first met her, she said, I am not going to die of this disease. I'm not going to wait till it gets so bad that I can't do anything. And she was so clear about that. And, one thing about end of life doulas, it's a whole new realm. It's a whole new field. It's important, especially because there are not enough trained clinicians to go around to support people at the end of life. On the other hand, in all the cases that I've been involved with, I really understand how being a nurse makes a difference in terms of being an end of life midwife, doula, because you understand parts of the healthcare system and parts of what's going on with people's diseases, and know how to navigate a healthcare system in ways that, there are doulas now who are just like doing a 6-week course online and have had no medical training before that. And so you really have to vet the people who are being doulas, because people are, putting up websites saying, I'm an end of life doula. It's like their mother died, they took a class online, and they think they know everything about death and dying. And that part makes me nervous as, someone with many years of experience at the bedside of people dying. And there's a difference. And I just think it's very important to understand that people who are showing up at the bedsides of people who are dying need a lot of different levels of understanding and education to really be present. And, it's another one of these tricky things, because there's no, there's no rules and regs for what it means to be an end of life doula. And, there are a few different courses. The course at University of Vermont is a great course. A friend of mine helps teach it, Diane Button, who you may have met. Yeah, she's fabulous. And the INELDA course, the International End of Life Doula Association, that comes out of New York, is a really good course. There are a few that are really good, but there are a lot of these kind of wild things that happen on the internet that we just all have to be careful about. I'm just kind of looking back at my notes of some of your questions. This idea about the kinds of options that we have at the end of life. I mean, in some states, there is the End of Life Option Act, like there is in California. But they're kind of few and far between. There's only a handful of states where it's legal to get the medication to say, I have a serious illness. I do not want to suffer any more than I have already suffered. And I know when it's my time. Carol and I had a dear friend who used the end of life option meds. I guess is it 3 or 4 years ago now, which is kind of scary. She had end stage lung cancer. Her quality of life was diminished by her disease. And she had been like this Amazon woman warrior. I mean, she swam in the bay in San Francisco 3 times a week. She ate everything right. She did everything right. When I worked in a health food store in my younger days, I had a button that said, eat healthy, stay fit, die anyway. It's just a reality. And, with our friend, Catherine, the last time she went into the water to go swimming and got short of breath and felt like, oh my God, I'm going to die right here and now. That was her line in the sand. It's like, I'm done. If I can't do the things that really fulfill me and give my life meaning and joy, then I'm ready to go. And it's it's a hard decision to make, but the people who I've been with who have made that decision were very clear. And you kind of have to be very clear in order to get the medications. But it is important that, at least in some places, there is that choice. You know, the other way we have choices, like I said, is to really to create legal documents that are really personal, that are really clear, that are really specific about how you imagine the end of your life being, what's important to you. If you have never seen this deck of cards called Go Wish, you can get them online. They used to be $10 when I buy them in bulk. So it's an amazing card game. It's a great way to have a conversation with friends, with family. And this isn't so much about, do I want to be hooked up to a ventilator, or do I want to, you know, what do I want dialysis? Do I want medical interventions? It's more about how you want to be treated, what's important to you. So it's a whole deck of cards. And on the back of each card is some wish that you might have for how you want to be treated towards the end of your life. You know, and it's everything from not being short of breath, taking care of unfinished business, not being a burden to my family, not being connected to machines, being able to pray. And you go through this whole deck. And you can do it with someone. And you go through each card and you make 3 piles, a pile of things that this is really important to me, a pile of sort of kind of maybe, and a discard pile. I don't care about that. Then you go back to the pile that's your most important things, and you try to narrow it down to like your top 5. And then use those to inform what you write in your advance directive, to inform your conversation with people about, you know what, this is really important to me. Because so often, especially with people that we're close to, we assume that we know what's important to them. And people assume they know what's important to us. And we all know about assumptions. They don't always work. And so this way you get to actually have a clear conversation about what's important to you and what's important to the other person. The woman who developed this deck of cards, Betty Mencken, was a palliative care physician. And she was working a lot with adult children and their parents. And she would have the adult child cut the deck the way they thought their mother would want things, and then have the mother cut the deck. And invariably, there would be differences, you know, with the adult daughter saying, oh my God, Mom, I was sure, you know, this was most important to you. And Mom saying, no, that's not what's most important to me. And it has just become a really useful tool in normalizing conversations. You know, I tell people in my workshops, get a few decks, invite people over to play cards. Just don't tell them what card game you're going to play. You know, they're going to think you said go fish. Like, no, it's go wish. You know, I find that when you have these kind of conversations, either with the cards or when I've done advanced directive workshops with groups of people who are actually connected to each other, then the conversation can really go to a different kind of depth about what is important to you. What choices do you want to make? You know, for a lot of people, dying at home is important. Other people, they feel much safer in a clinical hospital kind of setting, you know, where they can press a button and ideally a nurse or someone shows up to help them. It's important to know that. It's important to know if dying at home is important to you. It's not so easy to die at home. I mean, you really need a hospice team to be taking care of the medical pieces, but most people need 24/7 care. And so you either need the resources of people, of friends and family who can provide care, and or the financial resources to be able to hire people to help you. And that's another thing that it's really important to think about ahead of time. Have a savings account for, I really want to die at home and I want my friends and family to be able to hire the kind of help that I'm going to need, so that you're not a burden on your family, so that you're not a burden on the people who love you, and they don't have to be there 24/7. Those are things that are important to think about. It's also important for people, for whoever's going to be your medical power of attorney for a healthcare, your friends, to really understand what it means to advocate for you, to advocate for what your wishes are. People can die good deaths in a hospital setting if they have an advocate there at their bedside. People get so intimidated in hospital settings. It's hard to come up against, the ICU doctor, the medical team, this person, that person, say, wait a minute, stop. This is not what this person wanted. But somebody needs to be able to do that and really be the advocate. And even at the end of life, when people are dying, when I was running an intensive care unit, and granted, it was a 4-bed unit in a small rural hospital. But when we understood that someone was going to die, we made sure that their family, their loved ones, people who cared, knew and were able to do some kind of whatever the ceremony was at their bedside, so that the people who loved them could also have closure. There was a young woman who was dying who, we kept her alive until her family could fly in. Her dad and her mom were estranged. One of them lived in LA. It took a couple of days for them to get there. And, she was like 20 years old, and was dying of an overdose, basically. But her family finally all arrived. And so before we extubated her and took the tube out and took her off the machines, they all were holding hands around her bedside and singing these beautiful songs, so that there could be closure for not only the person dying, but the people around them. And so it's important to ask for what you want and need. We did a lot of rituals at the bedside in that ICU. And, because sometimes people have to die in hospitals. We can't all die at home. But again, talking about what's important to you is the only way for people to know what's important to you.
Redwing, this is Laura. We have about a half an hour left. I'd love there to be time for discussion and questions. Is that okay?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Is that okay, Lisa?
Yeah.
Well, I want to know, I think you helped Polly Taylor, Carol and my friend. She did VSED, didn't she? How can if I choose VSED, what am I expecting?
So VSED, if people don't know, is voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. It's kind of become a thing in, recent years. And, Polly was another person who was very clear that there was going to come a point in her life when the suffering was going to be too much. I mean, she had been oxygen dependent for a long time. She knew she had a chronic end stage lung disease.
Mm-hmm.
And she had said to me early on, there's going to come a point when my quality of life is not going to be okay with me anymore. And what happened is that she got a terrible flu. And, we'd been having these conversations for a while, and then she got really sick. And she basically said, okay, I had this horrible flu. I haven't been able to leave my home. I haven't been able to do the things that are important to me anymore. I know I'm not going to get a lot better. I've already stopped eating and drinking for a few days because I've been so sick. So let's just keep doing this. Now, I think Polly, as with most people, think if I stop eating and drinking, I'm going to be dead tomorrow.
Yeah.
Well, it was about 16 or 17 days of Polly lying there in the bed. Luckily, her support team were all on board. We got her on hospice right away so that we had the medications that we needed to keep her comfortable, which is critical when someone is stopping eating and drinking voluntarily. Because, they're likely going to have some pain issues, some discomfort issues, some anxiety issues. So you want the medications that basically the hospice team can provide. You also don't want issues of people not having seen a doctor, because then it becomes a coroner's case and it's complicated. So getting someone on hospice when they're in that state is really makes a difference. And then it takes as long as it takes. It's like, yes, you can moisten their lips and their mouths so that they're not really dry and uncomfortable, which is important. And there were a couple of times when people were like, oh no, should we just, give her some ice cream, give her something to drink? I was like, no, this is really what she wanted. And so she had this amazing team of women around her who supported her in that process for as many days as it took. And the hospice team was there to support her medically. So the main thing with BSET is not to expect it to happen overnight. And, it depends on what else is going on with you physically and medically, what that process is going to look like. But, in the olden days, before we had all of this medical technology, when people were dying, they stopped eating. When you're really sick, when you have some kind of sickness, eating is not necessarily what you want. And yet again, we live in a culture where every subculture of our culture thinks that, oh no, if you just have some chicken soup, you'll get better. If you just have this kale smoothie, you'll get better. I know this is going to make you feel better. This is how we show love, is by feeding people. And yet when people are trying to die, the body doesn't need to keep being fed.
Thank you. I want to just ask one more question. And then I'll try to be quiet. I've heard some horror stories about people who want to die at home, who have plans to die at home and end up at the hospital. And since clinicians are pledged to keep people alive, they won't let them.
Hello.
That's why you need a very clear advance directive for healthcare. I mean, if you don't have anything in writing that states what you want and what you do not want, then yes, the healthcare system is going to keep you alive if they don't have the instruction that says you don't want that. In California and in a lot of states, we have what's called a POLST form, POLST, Physician's Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment. In Massachusetts, it's a MOLST form, medical orders. And that is a piece of paper that also states your wishes for what happens outside of the hospital. If you are at home and your heart stops and you stop breathing, when 911 gets called and the EMTs show up, if you don't have a piece of paper that says clearly what you want and you don't want, they have to legally keep you alive at all costs. The POLST form is a doctor's order. It's signed by a doctor, which is the only way that the emergency medical folks can not attempt to resuscitate you, is if they have a doctor's order that says that. But it's really critical to have very specific things in writing about what you want and what you don't want, so that those situations don't happen.
Thank you. How about other questions?
Yeah, Naj has her hand up. Go ahead, Naj.
I have a question and a comment, and I guess I'll make the comment first. I have taken care of two people who died at home, and that really, what someone's skill is really important. So if you have a lover or a friend that you're wanting to help, die at home or even in a hospital. If your skill isn't being a caregiver, you're, believe me, you have some skill that they need, but don't try and be a caregiver if that's not your skill. It'll be disastrous for the person you're trying to care for and yourself. But my question is, I do not have an advance directive, but I have I'm pretty adamant about what I want and don't want. But my medical power of attorney is a nurse in her 40s who we're on the same page about what I want and don't want. Is that good enough?
Needs
So
to be
do you
writing.
have something in writing?
Other than that she's my medical power of attorney, I do not. Because it's
So-
too, I mean, I've resisted it because it's so complicated. Like you said, there are situations where treatment, I might want to have treatment, but other situations where I don't.
So so if you, when you're saying you have a medical power of attorney, that to me implies that there is some piece of paper that states this person
Yes.
is my medical power of attorney.
Yes.
So, there's a million different forms that all mean the same thing. So a medical power of attorney is the same thing as an advance directive for healthcare, is the same thing as, what we used to call a living will, but living wills didn't name somebody else to speak for you. If you have a legal piece of paper that states this is the person who is speaking for me and because she knows exactly what I want and is willing to follow through with my wishes. Yes, as long as you really trust that that person knows you well enough that you don't have to be specific about what you want and you don't want. You can make your own advance directive be as simple or as complicated as you want, quite honestly. I use a form that was developed at UCSF by a palliative care doctor. It's in very simple language. You can fill in the parts that you like about it. It's the California Advance Directive for Healthcare, but it's actually available for pretty much every state. And I can send Laura the links to these things because it's a really user-friendly document. And the other critical thing is that once you have that piece of paper and you've notarized it or gotten it witnessed so that it's a legal document, making sure that it's part of your electronic medical record in whatever healthcare system you're part of, making sure your doctor has it, making sure the person who's your power of attorney for healthcare has a copy. I've downloaded mine onto a thumb drive that I have in my purse that says, Redwing Advance Directive on it, so that if I end up somewhere that's not my healthcare system, somebody has access to it. There are USB port bracelets that you can get that you can put your information on. There are different ways to make sure that you have that information when it's needed, but it's just important to be as clear as you can be. And like you say, for the person who is going to be your decision maker, if you can't speak for yourself, to really know what your choices are.
Thank you.
So I have a question, and then after me is Meryl and then Phyllis. So my question is, I want to know, whether you feel like you have emotionally, you said you read the Stephen Levine book, which I've read too in my Buddhist group. If you emotionally and spiritually feel ready to choose to end your life, if that's needed, and if not, or if so, how you got to that, or if you have any suggestions on how we can get to that.
Practice dying. It's one of the ways to practice is to show up for other people. because the more people that we witness in the dying process and actually at the time of death, the more we understand about what that incredible transformation looks like and feels like. I feel like I've been in hundreds of bedsides of people who have died, and each one is completely different. And the first ones I was at made it so clear to me that this shell that carries our spirit around for as many years as it does is just a shell. It's the spirit that animates this shell. And coming to terms with the fact that for me, I believe that my spirit is going to leave this body and go on to become part of the universe, maybe come back, maybe not, but it's helpful for me. And I do a lot of meditation practices where, when you meditate, you can practice that the next out breath might be my last out breath. There are many different kinds of practices you can do, and ongoing conversations with people about it. It's always, the idea of really dying is of course scary. I mean, when I was diagnosed with cancer, it's like, when some doctor sitting across the table from you saying you have cancer, the first thought in pretty much everybody's mind is, shit, I'm going to die.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're going through treatment, that's how you feel, like, oh my God, I'm going to die. And then you realize, yeah, I am going to die. Everybody's going to die. And, in palliative care, we talk a lot about, hoping for the best and planning for the worst, planning for the most challenging things, making sure that the people who you care about and who are going to be there for you when you're dying know what you want. Having that conversation regularly. I mean, my partner and I talk about it a lot and sort of fine tune things a lot. And trust that when it's your time, you're going to be ready. I mean, I think having these conversations is one of the best ways to do that, really. I was just with someone last night who's kind of a new friend who has a really aggressive kind of cancer. And she had to convince her doctors to give her the end of life medicines because she has a kind of cancer that could like switch and become deadly in a matter of days. And yet at the same time, she's applying to be in clinical trials, and she wants to keep living, but she's very prepared for dying at the same time. And I think when we have serious illness, that's an important and tricky balance, but we have to always keep it in mind.
Okay, thank you.
And living every day as if it's your last. It's like,
Yes.
enjoy every moment. Say I love you. Give forgiveness, ask for forgiveness, do all those things that we talk about doing on our deathbeds, but do them regularly.
Thank you. Meryl.
Oh, good. Yeah, thanks. I had a quick question and a quick comment about if a person's paperwork is inaccessible in the case of an emergency away from home. And then I think about the emergency medical people doing what I definitely do not want done, but my paperwork is inaccessible and maybe a person can't be found either. And I do have a friend who has "Do Not Resuscitate" tattoo on her chest. And I was wondering how effective that would be to stop resuscitation before it started while somebody makes more of an attempt to get the paperwork. Because I'm thinking about it too. Maybe just the initials. My skin is kind of fragile for a long word these days.
So that is not a legal thing. I mean, it's an idea, people do it. It's not, having a tattoo. The only way that the emergency medical folks cannot resuscitate you is if you have a doctor's order. Now, I don't know what the form is in Tennessee. Like in most states, it's called physician's orders for life-sustaining treatment. Some states, it's called medical orders. Those forms were put into place in California, and they became legal in 2009. If your doctor could honestly say they wouldn't be surprised if you died in the next year or two, then it's absolutely appropriate to have one of those forms. Or if you're someone who feels really strongly, if my heart stops, I stop breathing. No, do not jump on my chest. Do not put paddles on me. Do not put a big honking tube down my throat and try to get me to breathe again. Then it's important to have that document. Like I said, I don't know about the legalities in every state, but to have a document that is a conversation with your doctor and is signed by your doctor, and then it's posted on your refrigerator or on the wall above your bed or somewhere in your house. And people carry a card with them sometimes that says they have a post form. Post forms for what happens outside of the hospital. Once you're in the hospital, that's when your advanced directive for healthcare and you're the person who you have chosen to be your decision maker. That's when their power goes into effect, is once you're in the hospital. So if someone has brought you to the hospital and kept you alive to get there, but it's clear you don't want to be on a ventilator, you don't want to be on machines, that's where the person who is your advocate shows up or gets a phone call and says, no, 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 she does not want extraordinary measures. She wants A&D, allow natural death. She wants to be able to go in peace. And again, that has to be in writing in order for the healthcare system to abide by it.
Okay. Another question, Lisa?
Yes, Phyllis.
Yes. Thank you so much, Redwing, first of all, for this information. Is really quite wonderful. And I really appreciate hearing all this. My question is, do you do workshops online? And since we are all over the United States, is there any way to access workshops with you?
So since March of 2020, when the world shut down, everything I teach is ending up online. Yeah, I mean, I used to do this stuff as weekend workshops, and someday I hope to do that again, because it's really different to be in person in a residential kind of retreat with people for a few days talking about this stuff. But yeah, pretty much every year through the program I work with at UCSF, this course called Last Acts of Kindness. It typically happens in the winter, and we don't have dates yet for when the next session is going to be. There's a sliding scale fee for the course. So I can get that information to Laura. The other thing I can say is I do occasionally, just if there's enough people who want to do a group like with people that they know. Sometimes I just do advanced directive workshops with groups that, like I said, it's a 2-part, like 2 hours one week and 2 hours a couple of weeks later, where we go into a lot of questions and concerns about, okay, what are your choices? What do you want? And it's also a kind of in-depth conversation. So that kind of thing, I do offer to small groups, and, there's a small fee involved, but I'm open to doing that. So
Online.
I don't,
Wait,
oh
wait.
yeah, it's
If
all
we're
online.
local with you, do you still do one-on-one like you did with Polly and Catherine and so many others? Can you help us in the process?
I do occasional one-on-ones, because right now I'm still working. And so my time is pretty limited. So I do very occasional one-on-ones. So, people can contact me if I have the bandwidth, I will do it. My goal is to retire by 2026 and have a little more availability. But
What is your
yeah, and
I'm sorry. What is your contact information? How do we get a hold?
let me put it in the chat.
Okay, thank you.
And Phyllis, I sent you in the email about Redwing, I gave you a link to her website, personal website and work website at UCSF.
Thank you.
Well, this definitely seems like something that OLOC should consider doing. Maybe,
Yes.
offering. I'm wondering, when you say Redwing, you want a small group, what size are you looking for when you talk, and what would you be covering?
So when I do like the kind of advanced directive course where it's 2 hours 1 week and 2 hours a couple of weeks later, we basically go over what it really means to create a document that's meaningful for you. And what some of the stuff we've talked about today in terms of who you choose, what it means to be a decision maker for someone, who the people are who you should choose, and then people's questions about all the what ifs. What should as well as, because advanced directives can also include your wishes and thoughts about what you want to happen both at the time of death and after death. Those kinds of things are important to consider as well. And these days, we're having like more and more choices every day. It's not just burial or cremation. Now there's aquamation in the Bay Area, and there's composting bodies, and there's all kinds of decisions that we can make, but a lot of people don't even know about that stuff. So we go into all those questions, and then when people come back the 2 weeks later, ideally they've done some homework, they've had conversations, and they come back with the last question so that they can really have a meaningful document. So that's kind of an advanced directive workshop. The 4-part series of Last Acts of Kindness is really kind of goes more into the depth of, what it means to be mortal, what it means to die, the spiritual, emotional aspects of that. And that's a 4-week class that's an hour and a half to 2 hours each week.
Well, it sounds like we should be in touch with you and OLOC about this.
Just to be clear, we're OLOC members, but we're kind of ad hoc-y. I mean, OLOC, National OLOC schedules programs, around the country, but and actually one of our members, is it you, Sue, who's going to do a program next Monday?
Oh, thank you for pointing this out. It's coming this Monday, September 16th, September 16th at 4 p.m. Eastern time. I would love for you all to be on it. Love it. Thank you. It's an open house. Anybody can be on it. You don't even have to be a member of OLOC.
So why don't you just say quickly what it is, Sue?
Yeah, it's just an open house. Everybody can talk. You line up, you put up your little yellow hands in one row after another, and you say whatever you want
about the subject.
It's what we're doing right now. It's thanks to you. It was supposed to be a number of you, but it's just me. So I'm sorry. We're going to do it.
Lisa, do we have time for one question? But I also want to have a request for Redwing.
We have 8 minutes, so go ahead.
Is there a time for another question?
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't have it. Let's call on someone.
Okay. I'm looking. There's no hands up. That's why I was asking if you had questions. Does anybody have a question? Okay.
Well,
okay. Sue has a question. Go
good,
ahead.
good.
Yes, I'm curious. You also were a nurse, And then you became a doula. What was your training and how did you find clients afterwards? I'm up a tree as to what to do. Well, I'm not really. I can join a hospice. I can go through churches, through the senior center, etc. But I'm just curious. Thank you.
So the truth is, like I said at the beginning, I became a nurse in order to be a midwife to the dying. So quite honestly, I feel like all of the spiritual teachings that I have garnered throughout my life, as well as all the things that we learn in order to become a nurse, are what taught me how to do what I do.
Mhm.
I have a number of different spiritual practices where I work a lot with what it means to be mortal. And because I started doing this way before doulas became a thing, basically I've lived in communities where people have known the work that I do and called on me to be at their bedside. And that's kind of how it started. I also, because I taught workshops in spiritual care of the dying for years, people knew who I was and so would contact me. So now it's pretty much just word of mouth, which is how I like it, because it's not like I'm doing this as work. And if I do, maybe I will likely create another website. There's also in California, there's a Bay Area doula network, a kind of consortium where they vet, and Diane Button, who teaches at UVM, is actually the person who started that. And she and her core group vet people so that they make sure that the doulas who they're recommending have had adequate training, have adequate understanding, which I've always really appreciated about their organizations. So that at UCSF, a lot of us especially in palliative care, are connected to her organization because we trust that the people who she's recommending are good at what they do. And so, doctors and nurses and the hospice teams locally call on her to get recommendations for doulas. And I think if there's some organization where you live that does vet doulas, that's a great way to do it.
Well, I just want to thank you, but before, I just had one quick question. I realize that I really haven't sussed out exactly the difference between a chaplain. My mother was a chaplain and worked with people who were dying. She was a Quaker, Jewish Quaker. Anyhow, I'm wondering how is the training in terms of, you have a unique background because you worked with the Zen Center and you have a Buddhist practice, but do most of the end of life trainings have the ones that you're talking about, the one in Berkeley in particular, but the one in New York and Vermont, have a kind of spiritual component that's similar to chaplains?
I think, yes, they all have a spiritual component. They all encourage having a spiritual practice of one's own in order to be able to show up and be present. I think that is an important piece of all of the better doula programs, for sure. Chaplains are typically trained in, kind of a broad range of spiritual practices, from the religious to what we just call spiritual. I feel like chaplains are more trained as spiritual counselors. But honestly, I feel like the work that we all end up doing at the bedside is very similar. Some people who have a religious, history or a certain kind of religion or practice that's important to them want someone who understands that practice. I'll just quick story. About 6 months before my sister died, my brother and I were visiting her in Southern California, and we were about to go down for a walk on the beach. And she said, "Wait, before we go, I need to talk to you." And we sat down in the living room with my sister and her husband and my brother and I, and she said, we didn't grow up with any religion. And my sister, who had already had cancer for 10 years, never wanted to talk about dying. And she said, we didn't grow up with any religion. And I don't really know what this spiritual stuff is that you talk about, looking at me. And she said, but I know that without either one of those things, it's going to be hard to die. And I need help.
Mhm.
That was such an important moment because it opened a door to then be able to have conversations with her in the last 6 months, and then especially in the last 2 weeks when I was at her bedside. It just, for her to have that understanding and be able to say that out loud was so important. And my experience at bedsides is that it's true that when people don't have any kind of religious or spiritual practice, it often is harder to let go.
And also, I have to say, when my mother died, she had one of the chaplains there who was a lesbian, who she had trained. And what was nice was that it wasn't really a spiritual thing. It was more that she brought out to the rest of us. She said to my mother, is there anything you want to say to your kids? We were all there. Just helping to guide the conversation and the emotional closure. And I think that's very important.
It's very important. And I think that that is a piece that doulas can also do.
Okay.
So, is it time to wrap up, Lisa?
Yes, it's 3.
Redwing, I'm so glad that this person called Redwing Keyssar manifested herself. I've heard about you for years from Carol, from the other women at 190 Coleridge, from the Mortals group, and so forth. So I am absolutely pleased. And I do have a request, but first I want to know that if, as long as it's before 2026, might we call upon you again?
Definitely. Yeah.
Well, especially if we wanted to create a class and,
Yes.
and have people pay and do one of those trainings, I would like to work on that. And if you're open to that, I would.
Yes, definitely. I mean, my schedule is a little crazy, so I'd have to have, some definitely advance notice, and then we could talk about what it exactly is that you want. But yes, I'm open.
So I have a final request. If you can put your hands on your poem on your website called Between Worlds, would you read it?
Yes.
And I may cry.
It's a little long, but I am honored to be asked to read it. So this is actually a poem that I wrote. Whoops. Sorry. What just happened? There we go. I originally wrote this as a song and then it became a poem. We have seen and heard and touched and tasted so many things in these short lives that we may not need to come back here again. We are spirits weaving in and out, our thin threads binding us briefly to this web of life. Trying on the costumes of human form, we pass through this realm. And yes, there's earth and air and water and fire. And yes, there's love and hate and fear and joy and desire. And there is a universe of light beyond this star, where the distance between the dream and reality isn't so far. Where time and space provide no security. And without hesitation, I let go of you, and you let go of me. And there will be a moment outside of time, teetering on the edge between this world and that, between in-breath and out, when without hesitation, you will let go of you, and I will let go of me.
Thank you so much, Redwood, for joining us today.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Many blessings.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We will be in touch, someone from here. Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody. Hugs all around.
Namaste, they say.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
I do have, oh, Redwing, I would like to ask, what's the cost if OLOT, because OLOT could very well pay for this.
Yeah.
What is the cost of you doing a workshop online?
You know, it's kind of depends on numbers and what the workshop is. So let's be in touch on email to talk about that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. And we'll talk more
you.
about organizing this next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Redwing.
Welcome.